Okay. So as I mentioned in our beginning of when does adolescence end and when does early young adulthood end, I want to bring up the point that again, this is a debate, as we would say, based on cohorts that are being raised, based upon maturation rates. So as I mentioned in our beginning of when does adolescence end and when does early young adulthood end, I want to bring up the point that again, sorry about that. All right. Forgot to hit mute on our YouTube. Oh yeah. Sorry about that, everyone. I don't know what just happened. My computer just shut down on me. I apologize about that, but we will continue with class. I don't know why that happened, but I appreciate you all staying on. So let me find the presentation again. Um, okay, let me stop this. Share screen. Okay, let's try this again. Um, Okay, so back to what I was talking about. When we were talking about adolescence, it's hard to see what the transition is between um, adolescence and early adulthood. This first slide suggests about 18 to 40, based on research, some of the current cohorts that are going through this transition. We're thinking more like 27 to 45. And so please don't look at this first bullet point and think that this is the end of the story, that this is what it is. By the time we reach early adulthood, though, we have spent a long time in developing. And so what we're going to see when we do get into early adulthood is we're going to see the rate of our body slow down as far as growth and rate. The majority of our brain development has occurred. Um, And we basically have the vocabulary that we're going to use for the rest of our life as far as language is concerned. Our way we're going to socialize with either people are kind of set, even though, and I do want to make this point, these are changeable. It just makes it more difficult. Okay. Um, and so this is kind of what we're working with as we're starting to look at slower growth. Okay. We do know that as far as physical health, early adulthood is when you're going to be at your peak physical capacity. So in our 20s, later 20s, and early 30s, we even have more strength and physical strength and height than we did in our late teen years or in our teen years when we think um, um, uh, humans are at their most physical ability. It's actually in the later 20s, early 30s that we become our strongest. And hence, if you look at professional weightlifting, if you look at professional strongman competitions, they actually don't qualify someone to participate in those until their later 20s because of the risk that is associated. Now, that doesn't mean there's amateur or junior leagues. It's just the professional leagues. They require that. So that's an example that emphasizes that group. And we also know, also with physical strength and everything, this is when our vision is the best, our hearing is at its peak level, and our sensory capacities are at their best levels that they'll be throughout our lifespan. And so when we think about this late 20s, early 30s period, we always have this assumption, oh my God, I'm hitting 30, right? I'm hitting the big 3-0, but technically it should be something we're looking forward to because between about the age of 26 to about the age of 38 is when we're at our most peak performance level as a human being, both cognitive, physically, sensory, emotional wise, and the like. But as we should say, change is imminent. So when we look at things like high pitch, dexterity, and those kinds of things, they do start to slow in the mid 30s range. So for example, by about 35, 36, 37, the elasticity in your skin starts to slow, meaning that um, um, if you, for example, if you lose a lot of weight, gain a lot of weight, lose a lot of weight, your skin starts to have that sag to it because it can't conform back to the constant weight loss and weight gain. So that's an example of elasticity issues. Now, the downside of early adulthood, of course, is we have legal abilities to damage our body with things like alcohol and tobacco, and we have easier access and access and the financial abilities to purchase illegal substances such as stimulants and narcotics. And indeed, when we look at a study that was done in Salt Lake City, Utah, they found that the highest rate of substance use, prescription drug abuse, utilization of illegal substances tended to be groups between about the age of 32 to about 40 is when we see the highest rates for inappropriate drug use, as you would say. Okay. The other thing that we start to recognize in our early adulthood is the transition from eating habits being regulated by the family to eating habits being independent of the family. So we're exercising our own ability to eat when we want, exercise when we want. It's no longer something that is controlled or regulated by the family system. So this can also lead to other health issues and more behavioral choices and whatnot if those weren't reinforced again in those early childhood years between 3 and 5, and then when we see the adolescent years with peer interaction. So that's physical development. And again, the point I want to make is going into young adulthood, even going into your 30s, there's a lot to look forward to. Your physical health is going to be at its best that it's been throughout your life. But not only that, cognitive development is going to reach what we call a plateau. Okay. But recent evidence suggests that it actually doesn't. And I'll get into the complexities of this in a little while, but traditionally it was thought that you're going to get to your highest cognitive level in early adulthood, and then it's going to stabilize. We're going to see that there's evidence even for this, in that we actually still continue to grow into middle adulthood and even have the ability into late adulthood. We do know that young adulthoods are able to take more abstract types of way of thinking and attain solutions and problems by comparing possible explanations. And so during this period, we're able to take multiple perspectives in order to make a conclusive decision. That doesn't mean it's the right decision, because it's all based on the information that is available to the individual. So we've talked about Piaget's theory about post-formal operations. The one I want to kind of introduce going into young adulthood is Riegel's theory, and it came out in 1975. And what he proposed is that the problem with the theories of Piaget, the ones that came out of childhood, is that in adulthood we're changed with we're exposed to and experience new cognitive challenges. Okay, we have to balance work and home. We have to look at education, pay bills. Dependent on our level of work and the complexity of work, it gives new demands than childhood and adolescence, where we went to school, all of those kinds of things. And what this creates is again the potential for cognitive growth, or if the environment isn't right, like when we were talking about Erik Erikson's, it can also lead to an imbalance or an ability to uh, have these cognitive demands. Okay. This is especially true in human environments. For example, someone we love can be warm and generous at times, but also on occasionally be self-centered and aloof. We're not quite used to that in early childhood. People tend to be fairly predictive when it comes to how they treat children. That doesn't mean they're always perfect, but for the most part, they tend to be more consistent across situations than the adults um, tend to be. We can be generous, selfish, we can be affectionate and remote, dependent upon the situation, our affect during that day, and those. So this is one of the other cognitive challenges that adults have to deal with, especially as far as going into a new world. So this requires some type of post-formal recognition. So he argued that this young adulthood period really is the stage of dialectical operationally. He also named this post-formal thought process as kind of taking from Piaget's, but it goes beyond what Piaget thought was formal operations, um, because it's because it's characterized by being able to take multiple perspectives. When we talk about Piaget, we're taking one individual and we're being able to think about them abstractly, their good qualities, their bad qualities, etc. With Riegel's post-formal thought, it's beyond that. It's being able to take on, okay, this is my experience with Jill, Bill, and and sometimes Anne thinks like Bill, and we kind of learn to take the complexity of these situations and do these cross comparisons between individuals. And this leads to kind of three broad stages of functioning characteristic in development into adulthood. And this comes from Kramer, but it's building off of that idea that Regal had. And really we can end up being put into one of these categories dependent upon how comfortable it makes us. Okay. So, for example, we go through an absolutist stage where we hold on to a belief system because we're comfortable with that belief system. So this is, for example, someone who strongly believes in Catholicism because it tends to help them um, uh, understand their world and be able to. And so anything outside of that religious idea or that religious dogma tends to be ignored. Probably another good example of is that everything will have an end, and one's going to lead to the next. Okay. The next level is relativist. Okay. In relativist, it's the idea that um, things are relative to a given situation. Okay. So this is a person who is able to separate, for example, their religious life with their secular life. Okay. Meaning that they can understand that the religion, they have faith that can guide their behavior, but that religious belief does not need to be a mission within your secular, your work life. If you want to think of relativists, they're the ones that are able to separate, for example, state and church as an example, that each one of them have their own unique contribution. Now, the issue with relativist is that everything is situationally bound. So you either use one guiding principle for one situation and another guiding principle for another situation. Dialectical thinking or dialectical cognition is the ability to have that conversation with yourself about how, for example, and I'll bring it back to religion and secular belief, about how your secular beliefs about work, um, uh, politics can inform your religious beliefs, and your religious beliefs, such as your morals and your ideals, can inform your political and your work ideals. Okay. Now, it doesn't mean that one dominates the other. It means that you can have this conversation that one isn't right, one isn't wrong, and that you can have this conversation about what is better for the world based on your experience, your belief. Probably the best example would be abortion rights. Okay. If you're pro-life, you tend to have a very fixed belief that life begins before birth. And if you're pro-choice, you believe that during the developmental period to birth has to do with the mother's well-being, mother's health, mother's choice, or I should say woman's choice. So that's a relativist experience. And for some people, it's an absolutist experience. For some, they cannot even see the point of view of the pro-choice if they're pro-life. The relativists are kind of like, well, there's certain situations where abortion should be acceptable, and there's certain situations where abortions are not. So this would be kind of the person that says if the mother's body is at risk, then it should be permissible for an abortion, as an example. That's a relativist idea. A dialectical idea would be, I'm not pro-choice, I'm not pro-life. I'm going to look at this from an analytical perspective. What is abortion? Why is it existing? And we find out, for example, in this thought process, almost all species have an abortion process. Okay. When we look at other species, and this is a dialectical example, when we look at other species, if there's not sufficient support to have a viable child and viable infant, such as there's not enough food, enough resources, enough stuff, that species will abort that child because the environment isn't conducive to it. Okay. And so a dialectical person will do that comparison and say, okay, so across species, there is this thing that exists. So there needs to be a solution to this. Maybe we need to look at, for example, resources. We need to look at building healthy families. We need to look at those causes that lead us to have an abortion. And those kinds of things. So that's kind of an example between these three levels of cognition. Okay. So again, reasons assume there is always a single answer. Dialectical is there's competing positions that need synthesized, and there's relativists who become aware there are often different perspectives. And the correct answer is dependent upon the situation that the person finds himself in. Okay. And as we see, and this makes sense because if you remember coming out of adolescence, when we talked about Piaget, we talked about the concrete operational phase, especially here in the United States, where we have this black and white thinking that there's right and there's wrong, there's black and there's white, and we don't cross those categories. Okay. So early in adulthood, we find that we tend to go through what's called an absolutist phase. And we find this to easily navigate this more complex world we're dealing with. Going back to the new challenges in adulthood, paying bills, going to college, um, finding a family relationship, all of these complexities that we're now dealing with, it's easier to think of these in simple categories. And it allows us to take these many problems and kind of compartmentalize them. People in the relative stage become aware that there are often different perspectives, though, okay, and that the correct answer depends upon the context. I'm going to underline this word because it's an important one. Context. That there isn't an absolute answer that goes into every context of a situation. And so I'll bring up kind of an example, okay? If you are a, let's say, piano player, there is a certain amount of physics, there is a certain amount of um, um, sensation, perception that's going on. But when you're playing a piano versus solving a math problem, you do that in two different contexts, that the context demands different areas of the brain. The piano playing deals with the spatial areas of the brain. The solving a math problem depends upon the prefrontal cortex. And maybe that's a good example of this relativist view. If you want to think it back to Einstein, time is relative idea, the theory of relativity is also a good example if you want to think about it that way. And then eventually the dialectical phase starts to people begin to integrate competing positions and achieving synthesis. So this is probably a good example of this is in the field of psychology, for example. When I did my dissertation, loneliness was studied as an emotional phenomenon, whereas identity was studied as a group phenomenon. And those two things didn't overlap. Okay. But for my dissertation, I combined those two fields of study to see if a group process influences an emotional process. Okay. And so that's kind of my example of kind of dialectical thinking, is that ability to take two things that seem unrelated, but see how they can be connected and interplay with each other. Okay. Um, Now, the issue with this is on a simpler level, and I shouldn't say an issue, on the simpler level, it allows us to take care of basic internal contradictions, such as maybe a religious belief that, for example, only Christians are nice, but I have an atheist friend who is nice, and we have to deal with that contradiction. Probably my example of this is when I went to college, and I was a what do they call a not a normal student, not I can't remember the term for it, non-traditional student. So I started later in adulthood and all those kinds of things. And in my family system, so now we're going back to the absolutist stage of development that I was in. In my family system, gay people were seen as devils, that if you interact with a gay person, they're going to influence you in some negative way and make you do immoral things. Okay. But when I was in college, I managed the university single screen movie theater, which was probably one of the funnest jobs I ever had. And I became really good friends with a uh, a coworker, one of the people who worked for me, and we became really, really close. And one day he came to me waiting in the foyer of the theater and said, "Hey, Curtis, I want to introduce you to somebody." And I said, "Okay." And he'd go over and he introduced me to this other young man. And I'm like, "Oh, this must be his best friend, his brother, and the like." And he said, "This is my partner." Um, and in that moment, I had an internal contradiction. I had an internal crisis. Sometimes they call this cognitive um, dissonance, where your values and beliefs don't play out in your behaviors, your attitudes, and your ideas. Okay. And this created conflict, internal contradictions. Okay. And I had to resolve that in some way. In order to do that, I had to take a dialectical perspective because the absolutist perspective was broken. Okay, and so then I became, and I took some classes, read some books, I became quote unquote educated, and I realized that those belief systems that I were raised with were false, and there was no evidence of the things that I was told as I was being raised. So that's an example of internal contradictions as our world starts to get more and more complex as we start going through the young adulthood years. Okay. So we also look at intelligence. Okay. If you remember, we defined intelligence in a couple ways. We've talked about emotional intelligence, but the most kind of one that has been studied, of course, is you know, school type of intelligence: math, reading, writing, um, uh, logic problems, those kinds of things, as we've talked about. And we've thought to discover at what age does difference in intelligence during adulthood. When are we at our peak, and when do we start to decline? Okay, and of course, keeping in mind this has always been measured psychometrically is an important aspect. So it's a numerical calculation. And there's some different ways to measure it. For example, we can do these are the primary areas that we're interested in. Numerical facilities, so math, verbal recall, so verbal understanding, verbal ability, the ability to use language, inductive reason. Inductive reasoning is starting with the puzzle pieces and creating a full and putting that puzzle together. That's different than deductive reasoning, which takes the complete puzzle and then breaks it down into its part. So this is a little bit more complex. It's more like, if you want to think about it, this is what detectives use when they're trying to solve a crime. Okay. And then spatial orientation. The most basic form is do we know that a circle doesn't fit in a square? That's probably the best kind of simple explanation of what we're looking for when we're looking at spatial orientation. So as we can see in this graph, okay, we can see that again, when we're getting in through early adulthood, and let me do a different color. Okay, we're doing red. And if we look at where are we peak wise, with the exception of this one, which is perceptual speed, because we know early, this is one thing that adolescents and especially young people do very, very well in, and it declines differently. But in all of the different areas of intelligence, we see that we're at our peak around our mid 40s to early 50s. Okay, so starting around 46, and we're at our peak coming down to about right here around the age of 55. Okay, again, it's kind of a myth breaker that individuals tend to be more intelligent, quote unquote, in early adulthood. That's why you don't want to look forward to your 30s, 40s, and 50s, because we assume that it's the straight beeline down. Where we are our most physically healthy, late 20s, early 30s. We're at our intellectual best from about 46 to 45 years of age. Okay. Again, with the exception of perceptual speed. So the reaction time is basically a good kind of descriptor of what perceptual speed is. And then we see it kind of stabilizes. There's not a lot of decline. We do see starting in our 60s, our perceptual speed continues to slow, and our numerical abilities start to slow somewhat the quickest. But between about the age of 55 way to our mid 60s, with the exception of these two, we kind of plateau. And then after about 67 or so is when we see these marked declines. But I'll make a point here. When we look at things like verbal ability, let me change the color to make this point. When we look at verbal ability, our verbal ability at 25 is about the same as it is when we're 88. They're about the same level, or at least 81, okay? And in fact, it's a little higher at 81. If we look at, for example, spatial orientation, where we are in space and time, if we draw a line over here, it's about early adulthood. It's about the same when we get to about the age of 75. When we look at, again, let's look at inductive reasoning. 25, we're right here, and we're about the same at about the age of 75 again. My point being with the exception of perceptual speed, it is a myth that early adulthood, even into middle adulthood, when we're getting into our late 30s and early 40s, is when we're at our cognitive intellectual best. Indeed, it's actually late middle adulthood, and then we plateau into our mid 60s that we're actually at our intellectual best, as you would say. I promised you all that I would give you something to look forward to through the lifespan. I think what I want to do is I want to save social emotional development for next time, for this Thursday, because this is an area that the transition from early adulthood into middle adulthood can have some different impacts, a lot like middle childhood into adolescence, but it tends to be in the social emotional area. When we look at this area going from young adulthood to late adulthood, we actually see a youth benefit in our current cohorts, in the last three cohorts. So this is people who have gone through middle adulthood since about the 1960s into the 1970s, okay? So this would include, for example, my generation and generations that started middle adulthood in about the late 1960s, okay? Is traditionally this middle adulthood area has been the backbone of a society. It's been the kind of the people who are the managers, the CEOs, the line workers. They tend to be the ones who have their college degree and now applying that college degree in some career. Those kinds of things that really support. But over what is it now, 50, 60 years now, we're looking, right? 40 and then yes, 64 years, 60 some years, is this area of adulthood is starting to break down on the socio-emotional area. And what I mean by that, and maybe this is not something to look forward to, you'll be your smartest at this age, but you may not be at your most social emotional best during these age groups. So just some quick statistics to end. As we see this transition from early adulthood into middle adulthood, we see middle adults are the #1 consumer of antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. We see that middle adults are now have the highest turnover rate for employment, highest divorce rates, and highest suicide rates, specifically with men, especially in their early to late 50s. So when it comes to the social emotional complexities of the world, we're going to complex things even more. A lot of people assume that it was early adulthood. It's our early adults and adolescents that are emotionally and socially breaking down and are the ones having the most difficulty. But as we will see on Thursday, and that's why I want to wait to look at this transition, it's actually going to be middle adults that we're going to see the higher levels of difficulty with socio-emotional development. So again, we may be at our smartest, but might be a tumultuous period for social and emotional development. Okay, so I'm going to hit escape right here. Discard those. I'm going to stop the sharing. I'm going to stop.